I'm Nina Rosman, and today we're going to talk about Malaysia's economic growth, as today we stand at a pivotal moments in Malaysia's journey where the nation confronts numerous challenges, from economic reforms and social justice to climate change and even global leadership. And yesterday, Prime Minister Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim, in his welcoming speech at the Khazanah Megatrends Forum 2024, he laid out on a comprehensive vision for Malaysia's future, and his call for a human economy for social justice and bold structural reforms comes at a time when both the local and global landscape are undergoing significant transformations. And to help us unpack the implications of this and explore Malaysia's role in the evolving geopolitical and economic climate, and I am honoured to have with me Dr. Trisha Yeo, the Associate Professor of Practice at the School of Politics and International Relations, University of Nottingham, Malaysia. I want to say thank you very much, Dr. Trisha, for joining me. And definitely talking about Khazanah Megatrends Forum 2024, we want to take a look and identify what are the global challenges, opportunities, and this is some of the megatrends that will shape the future of Malaysia also. And firstly, I'm going to take a look on the economic reforms and social justice, where the Prime Minister also emphasized on the need for human economy for social justice, where economic reforms prioritize equitable wealth distribution. Based on your perspective, Doctor, how feasible do you think this vision in the current Malaysia's socio-political climate?
Thank you so much for having me today. Indeed, I think not just Malaysia, but the world is at this critical moment where decisions have to be made in order to shape the future of our economy, of our social-political landscape, and so on. Some of the key trends that Prime Minister Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim in his speech yesterday talked about include things like climate change, the challenge of geopolitical shifts as well. One thing he talked about, which I agree with, is that we need to really urge to return to a rules-based environment, so a rules-based system that is practiced not just by regional players, but internationally as well. Every nation needs to see that all states are all playing by the same rules of the game, which is not something that we are necessarily seeing today. Where Malaysia sits in the context of these changes, we are ripe, I think, to be able to respond proactively. In the 2025 year ahead, Malaysia will be the chair of ASEAN, and it's an opportunity for not just Malaysia to showcase where we are as a nation, but also to provide some leadership in the region and to provide leadership for the world as a whole in terms of responding to issues, in terms of setting the tone for these various challenges. What these various challenges are will evolve as time comes, but some of the things that we are also approaching, and I think the government has taken these as priorities, will be things along the lines of digitalization. Where does government versus business lie with regards to digital regulation, reform, artificial intelligence? These are things that are being grappled with. Second is on climate change. So on this front, I do think the ministry is quite forward-thinking and forward-looking. Not only do we have the National Energy Transition Roadmap, we also have the recently launched climate change policy. But I think for those things, we've said all the right things in terms of putting forward our vision and policy and the policy. But what people now really need to see is that these things are catalyzed much more quickly, and that they are downstream faster, meaning that the industry is also in the know of what kind of value that they can provide. They are waiting to see as well what are the actionable things that they can do, what are the actual programs, what are the actual projects. And then I think just a quick third area will be in the energy and of course also security aspects. So they're quite related, because in terms of energy, I mean, I just talked about climate change, but for Malaysia, how quickly can we transition away from being coal dependent into relying on gas, and then eventually going on to the renewables. And how we get the energy transition and the energy mix right for the next generation also impacts upon our ability to provide security. So food security is one thing. Food security, we learned all about what happened in the COVID years when the region reacted by imposing a lot more protectionist policies, for example. Can Malaysia also ensure that at the end of the day, Malaysians not just have sufficient food to eat, but also are priced at the right amount? And this relates to many other things that Malaysia needs to do in terms of thinking of the systems, how to balance subsidy with floating prices to urge innovation and efficiency to eventually achieve security.
And to be honest, looking back, before pandemic COVID-19, we can see the focus of the governance, the public policy, and the civilian, we can see a bit different. Maybe they more focused on modernizations. And during pandemic, we're a bit step back, as we can see during the maybe early years of the pandemic and the recovery process like 2020 until 2022, we are more focused globally, we are more focused on the recovery. How can the economy get back up, and how can we ensure the well-being of the people, and probably in 2022, 2024, from what we have learned from the 2020 to 2022, okay, we know this is what happened to our economy, our country, and maybe this is something that we learn. And from 2022, 24, we can see a bit more focus on the technology, AI, and green initiative probably are the things that can save us in the future as well. And in PM also mentioned his alignment with Professor Joseph Stiglitz' concept of progressive capitalism and government intervention. How do you see this approach influencing Malaysia's economic policy moving forward, and what are some of the challenges that you see in the future might arise?
So in response to the first part of your question about things that we've learned in response to the pandemic, I think the pandemic, upon reflection, showed us a lot of institutional failures, actually, and it's not just Malaysia. I mean, it was common to many countries. The speed at which, for example, in the healthcare system, we were able to respond, but there were also a lot of gaps. In the hospitals, for example, in their inability to order the right equipment at the right speed and the right pace. You could also see the breakdown of the medical personnel. And these are some of the things that, of course, the Ministry of Health has now had to deal with post-mortem. So health is one. The other thing is the economy itself, right? So we also could see a lot of fragility, actually, in terms of people's incomes, very rapidly depleting. It gave us an insight into the tourism industry. It gave us an insight into SMEs, how they are very, very cash-strapped, and they are so reliant on the business that the moment things shut down, within a matter of a couple of months, we saw these numbers ballooning out of proportion, that many of the SMEs shut down. I think even in the tourism industry today, some of the hotels are still only now recovering from that period of time. Okay. So the resilience and the adaptability needs to be strengthened in order for there to, if there's any other pandemic that takes place or any other shock to the system, I think that's what this conference is all about. It's about our economy, or the pursuit of potatoes. The pursuit of potatoes, or the pursuit of something, of mechanisms that we can build into our economy and into society to ensure that we will always constantly be adaptable, flexible, but also resilient to withstand any externalities or unpredictable moments and events. In response to your second part of the question about this, finding this fine balancing act between what people normally refer to as unfettered capitalism, the idea that corporations and the private sector, when left to their own devices, will not take actions that are actually beneficial to society as a whole. So they're not thinking so much about the public good, but they're thinking more about the private goods and the private services, balancing that against the role of the state and the role of government. So Professor Stiglitz's book, which was echoed by Prime Minister Anwar in his own terms of the humane economy, with social justice, essentially what they're trying to say is that, you know, and this was actually also reflected in the keynote address this morning, where he talked about the Industrial Revolution from Europe actually set the tone for everything else that followed. We today are living in a rapidly industrialized world because of what the Industrial Revolution was able to provide to us at the very beginning of time, at the beginning of the revolution itself. What we've seen, and this is what Stiglitz and Prime Minister Anwar are trying to say, is that there is a need for regulation. And that is true. It is important for the government to be able to provide that regulation to ensure that the players in the market know what their boundaries are. They know what they can and they cannot do. I think the problem is when, number one, if the state is not transparent about that regulation. Number two, if the regulation is unfairly imposed upon players differently, meaning that not all players receive the same treatment and the same regulation, or if they're not transparent about it. And also number three, if the government also takes their regulatory role into their hands so much so that they too overstep their boundaries and they become players in the markets. So not just becoming regulators and facilitating the possibility of the market to do what it would like, but also to become players in the market itself. So I think it's very fair and right to talk about the government playing the role in financial regulation, in environmental regulation. I mean, I completely agree with those things, but I think I would also like to point out the three possible pitfalls when these regulatory reforms are not done in the right way. And we do see many examples of that in Malaysia. And so in our pursuit of ensuring that we want to control the private sector from not posing harms onto society, we must also remember that they need to do that responsibly. They need to do that with the right balance themselves. And as I said, making sure that they're treating all the players equally. So sometimes that's not the case. Yeah.
And I like what you mentioned previously, that you said that maybe one of the agenda from this forum and all the initiative that has been made by the government is to strengthen the adaptability and resilience, especially for SMEs, tourism sector. All sectors were affected, but this is one of the biggest sector that was mostly affected the worst, and they are the backbone of the country, which most of the countries. And Malaysia's structural reforms, as you say, including, as you mentioned earlier, a subsidy rationalisation and floating price for essentials. From a political governance perspective, how do you think this reform will impact the trust and confidence of the public? As you mentioned, is one of the effect is probably the regulatory was not translate transparently, and maybe it was imposed in a wrong direction, and maybe too much from regulatory section that possibly taking all the markets. Probably we can share with us, probably, how do you think this reform, maybe it's seen for a longer term, it's for the benefit of the country, but for the short term, maybe they say, are we going to sacrifice our short term probably a well-being just for the sake of a long-term benefit of the country? What's your take on this?
So we've been talking about structural reforms, both in terms of institutions as well as in the economy, for a really long time. This predates this administration. These conversations have gone back to 10, 20 years in the past. The problem is that governments and politicians are very sensitive, hypersensitive to any sort of change that would possibly impact the earning power or the savings power of citizens in the today, in the present day. So because they are a lot of short-term thinking, they need to also know about the long-term effects of that, which is why I'm actually quite glad to see that this has started. So this administration has started to put its money where its mouth is in terms of two things. One, the diesel subsidy rationalization, and two, also allowing the floating prices of things like chicken and eggs.
Yes.
And if you see that it's done incrementally, and if the government comes up with a very strong narrative as to why this is important, I believe people will be able to accept that. There are other things that will be coming as well. I mean, there's potentially things like, I'm not saying this is going to happen, I know budget is taking place soon, things like the fuel subsidy rationalization, RON 95. So that will impact most of us. We all use petrol, not so much diesel in our own cars. The other thing that is possibly going to happen, not now, maybe in the future, in the near future, or midterm future, would be the restoration of the GST or some form of consumption tax that goes beyond the sales and service tax. So if these things take place, what's needed is to have a strong narrative and a communication plan. So that's definitely the case. You need the government to tell the story about why in the long term it's important to shore up these fiscal reserves of the country in order to invest into things of the future like healthcare. I mean, we talked about how healthcare systems are also in dire need of financial injections, to be honest. And secondly, things like education. I mean, we can have a long session about education and why the schools are actually in need as well, infrastructure-wise. Many of the more rural vicinities of Sabah, Sarawak, Kelantan, Terengganu, Perlis, Kedah, even actually some parts of the more urbanized sites of Selangor, Perak, Johor, are in need of this renewal when it comes to education and healthcare. And the other aspect is to also remember that if the government can not just speak, so I talked about a strong communication plan, but also act when it comes to other policies in the same breath of economic reform. So other policies like institutional reforms, putting political reforms in place that will ensure that there's no wastage, there's no, financial leakage, let's put it nicely, into certain selected pockets. In the past, I think the problem is Malaysia has been subject to a lot of crony capitalism. So that's why they fear these things happening when they see that the government collections are on the rise and you see a repeat year after year where the Auditor General's report talks about wastage at the hands of certain civil servants within ministries. How does that make them feel about the responsibility and the ability of government to provide accountable bottom lines when it comes to the money that they are the stewards over? Ultimately, it's public money, right? Whatever monies are in government, it's our taxpayers' money. So being able to sell that story well and put together reforms that are more accountable. So some examples of this would be like the Government Procurement Act. So the Government Procurement Act is something the Ministry of Finance, I believe, is working on, and we hope to see that taking place soon because procurement has always been a source of great leakage and corruption. I mean, we see that, right? So put together these laws, put together these policies, and build the house right. Get the foundations right. On the economic part, yes, but also do it on the institutional front. And then the rakyat will be able to rebuild and restore their trust in government, which, to be honest, has been broken in the past and is very easily broken as well. And a final example I'll talk about, so I talked about the Government Procurement Act as an example. We already have the Public Finance and Fiscal Responsibility Act, which is great, but it can be improved. And finally, something that the former institution I used to work with, Ideas, championed for a long time is the Political Financing Act. So you put these legislations in place. There are many others, but I won't bore you. I mean, it's not enough time, I think, to talk about everything. But my point is putting these political reforms in place, simultaneous with the economic reforms, with a strong communication plan and a strong story to sell. That, to me, is the magic formula that the government needs to be able to put these things into place.
And I also wanted to take also from what you've said earlier, Malaysia's upcoming ASEAN chairman and the potential partnership with BRICS. How do you see Malaysia position itself in a shifting geopolitical landscape first? And second, probably as emerging economies, it's very important and essential for us to learn from advanced economies, high-income nations, because probably they have more sources, they have more suitable policies that maybe we can learn and adapt. But it's not only that, but how can we learn and adapt and lead the conversation and take the lead in this?
Yes, so I'll start with the last thing about how we can take a look at international best practices and examples from developed nations. We need to be careful about everything, so not all policy prescriptions from developed nations can be adapted to our local environment. We need to look at the context of Malaysia. We need to see, other conditions the same, like when other countries introduced those policies, were they the same as what we have today? But having said that, we do not want to reject everything either, right? So we take the best and we contextualize it to what we can use and operationalize immediately. When it comes to ASEAN and BRICS, so we know that ASEAN has not been as effective as it could be. Having said that, ASEAN centrality is also very important, and it's crucial at this particular moment in time, as there is the US-China trade war, which has expanded beyond just a trade war. It's a geopolitical positioning war, and it's not just involving US-China now. It's of course involved other players in the fray as well. Russia is there. And seeing what's happening in the Middle East as well is deeply concerning, I think, to many Malaysians. So ASEAN can play a role. ASEAN can play a role in navigating between the powers that be, and to demonstrate to the world that it's not as simplistic as a West versus the rest story that I think we tend to see or we tend to believe is the case. What we need to do to navigate between that is to talk about how relationships on the trade, on the foreign policy front are highly complex. These relationships sometimes even transcend geopolitics. If you look at the private sector, for example, they may be ambivalent when it comes to politics or geopolitics. They will continue to trade. They will continue to look for the supply chains that are the most efficient, that are the cheapest, that provide the best labor and factors of production, because they're thinking about ultimately how they're going to make their profits, right? So these relationships are complex, but to strongly argue that we want to, I think many nations in the world today are trying to navigate between these polarities.
Complexity and the dynamics of everything, correct.
I earlier talked about the importance of international rules-based policy, or returning or restoring the rules-based environment. I understand why our Prime Minister has applied for BRICS. In his speech yesterday, he talked about the global South-South. And this is precisely because we have seen too long, I think, the dominance of a primary geopolitical narrative. And it is really time for the smaller nations and the nations of the global South to speak about what their preferences are. So I see BRICS as more of a geopolitical and sort of making a political statement about this. It's probably less economic. I think till today we don't actually see what the positive effects would be for Malaysia to join BRICS, financially speaking. So, what are the benefits that we would get from the trade point of view? I don't think we've seen that yet. But from a point of view and a perspective of being able to put our arguments forward with a stronger collective with other BRICS nations, because now BRICS is not just about the original BRICS.
Correct.
Then I think there is great value there. So combination of the economic powerhouse of ASEAN being able to negotiate in terms of trade with the other blocs, and BRICS for a more global South geopolitical perspective. Perhaps the combination of these two things especially in 2025 next year, will put Malaysia in a very strong position to be able to set the tone and leadership for the rest of the world. We're also aware, of course, of the US presidential elections taking place next month.
Yeah.
So the results of that, I think, will also dictate how 2025 looks like for us.
Great, and the year moving forward.
Yeah.
And also, you also mentioned a little bit of the national budget, this upcoming national budget that will be tabled in 18 October. And in Prime Minister Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim's speech, he also mentioned the need for balancing populist demands and even responsible governance. Doctor, how do you view this balance in this context of Malaysia's upcoming political challenges, particularly in ensuring that reforms are both effective and publicly accepted?
So the positive thing that the Madani administration has going for itself at this point is political stability. We know that elections don't need to be called for till 2027. At the latest, of course, there is speculation that perhaps it might be a little bit earlier, we're not sure. But the point is, we're only in 2024, so we have at least 2 to 3 years to go before the elections takes place. This is the time that the government can really set leadership, that tone right in making the changes necessary towards governance. So we talked a lot about already institutional reforms, economic reforms, structural reforms. Those are the things that can be done now. And, you know, I think, yeah, he talked about the sometimes challenging dual positions of populism versus doing the right thing and getting the governance right. That's, I understand it's really important to strike that balance. But really, Malaysia doesn't, Malaysia, I think, at this point, would be more favorable towards the governance approach, because that is something that players around the world are also pursuing. So better governance also leads to better economic outcomes. That's what the evidence shows, and the likes of many of the international institutions would also say that. So like I said, if you have a strong narrative that shows us that actually economic outcomes and governance go hand in hand, they're not actually diametrically opposed to each other, and demonstrating the effects of that to people will actually show people that this is what you want.
Correct.
This is what you actually want to see in order to improve your livelihoods at the end of the day. Because if you get the governance right, you're building your house right, the structures will be there to provide the right opportunities for all of us to increase our wages and increase our incomes ultimately. So I think that's where we want to go, that's where we want to see. So hopefully we won't come to a place where populism, which is essentially looking at only the short-term gains as opposed to the long-term effects and positive outcomes, will not distract our administration from doing the right thing. And I must say, it's not just about government, right? So it's about the ecosystem. It's about all of us supporting that as well. So it's about civil society, it's about academia, it's about think tanks, the media, writers, the like in the economy, corporate sector, to be able to see that and to build a strong story that this is what's needed for all of us to prosper and prosper equally. The populist approach, I'll just give a last point before you get to the next question. The populist approach would be, for example, over-dependence on early EPF withdrawals, which is what the government had done previously. So because of COVID, because of the flood victims and so on, many of our Malaysian citizens actually took early withdrawals of EPF, and that is an example of populism winning, because you're taking away your early savings as opposed to being contributing those savings to what you would eventually need in your retirement. So I'm not sure if EPF has been able to plug that gap. I mean, well, EPF itself can't, because it's actually people's own savings, right? It's their own personal savings for the future. So I think people need to continue to think about what that did to people's personal savings and their pockets, because we need to talk about the looming retirement crisis. So yes, while we're doing all these structural reforms, have we actually resolved what happened in, under the previous administrations, which allowed these early withdrawals to take place? So the retirement crisis for those people, that remains unresolved, and that should not be repeated. Ideally, we should not go in that direction. Yeah. So if there's any other pandemic or any external shock that takes place that harms our economy, let's make sure that the governance approach, the long-term economic approach of getting the structure, the system right, eventually allowing our wages, our jobs, our incomes to rise, let's try to go there and not go to to the populist approach, because, yeah, like I said, that example is something that I think people will still be living the effects of in time to come.
And this is a very critical aspect that we should have a look on. And I know that we have to release you based on a tentative for this forum. You will have a session later. Maybe you can share with us briefly some teaser or context. What will you discuss at the stage later?
So my panel follows Professor Stiglitz's keynote address or main address from his book, I believe, and he will join the panel as well. And the panel will be on industrial policy. So we also have Dr. Nelson Barbosa, who is the former Minister of Finance from Brazil and currently heading the Central Bank of Brazil. So both gentlemen will probably be speaking about current industrial policy trends, very much along the lines, I think, of what we've discussed today, thinking about US, China, which are the countries that have a competitive edge in industrial policy. I will share Malaysia's perspective of this, but I will also add in some remarks about my area of research, which is on federalism and decentralization. I want to look at the role that subnational governments play or can play potentially in the future, like states or regions, not just in Malaysia, but around the world, what role they have in contributing to industrial policy. And I mean, some examples would be coming from, Malaysia. We've got Sarawak, Selangor, Johor, Penang. Like, these are the states that have very much attempted to do their own sort of industrial policy, even though technically speaking it's not under their mandate. So I'll be talking about that role that states play. Because ultimately, industry and the economy, the downstreaming of that will always happen at the state level, right? And second, I'll also talk about what happens when there's friction and tension between the central and the subnational levels of government, and how do we overcome that? And
again, I would say thank you very much, Dr. Trisha, for your insightful perspective on how Malaysia can navigate this complexity and what it means for the governance, and we can say the public policy and the nation's role in the future. As we look ahead, it's evident that we need to ensure that not only strong leadership, but also how can we engage and inform public policy. Definitely, again, I would say thank you very much for joining us, and I hope we can continue our important conversation like this in the future. Again, I would say thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
And definitely all of our discussion here will be featured in astroavenue.com and across all social media platforms. And that's it for me. I'm Nina Rosman. See you next time.